In 1971, a 17-year-old girl fell 2 miles from the sky. Her plane had been struck by lightning over the Amazon. She was the only survivor. She then walked alone through the jungle for 11 days with a broken collarbone, maggots eating her wounds, and no idea which direction led to safety. She made it out. Today, we're counting down 20 of the most extreme human survival stories ever documented. Number 20. Mauro Prosperi, lost in the Sahara for 9 days. The Marathon des Sables is already one of the most punishing races on Earth. 250 kilometers through the Moroccan Sahara, self-supported over 6 days. Competitors carry their own food. Temperatures exceed 50 degrees Celsius. It is, by any reasonable measure, something a sane person would not do. In 1994, Italian police officer Mauro Prosperi was running it when a sandstorm hit. Not a minor sandstorm. A wall of sand that lasted 8 hours and swallowed visibility completely. When it cleared, Prosperi was alone. He had run off course during the storm. He had no idea by how much. He was in the wrong country. He had crossed into Algeria without knowing it. For 9 days, Prosperi walked. He found a dry Marabout shrine, a small Islamic tomb, and sheltered inside it. He ate bats he caught by hand. He drank his own urine. When it became too concentrated to drink, he mixed it with bat blood. At one point, he decided he wasn't going to make it. He used a piece of his kit to open his wrists. His blood was so thick and dehydrated, it barely flowed. The wounds clotted almost immediately. His own body refused to let him die. He kept walking. He lost 16 kilograms. He hallucinated. His organs were beginning to shut down when a group of nomadic women found him and led him to a military camp. He had traveled 300 kilometers off course. He went back and finished the race the following year. He has now completed it 10 times. Some people's relationship with suffering is genuinely incomprehensible to the rest of us. Number 19. Poon Lim, 133 days alone on a raft in the Atlantic. In November 1942, a British merchant vessel called the SS Ben Lamont was torpedoed by a German U-boat in the middle of the South Atlantic. Of the crew of 55, only one man survived the sinking, a Chinese sailor named Poon Lim. He found a life raft. He had some basic provisions, a few tins of biscuits, some water, a flashlight, flares. Not enough for what was coming. He was alone on that raft for 133 days. 4.5 months in the middle of the ocean. What Poon Lim did over those months is a masterclass in methodical survival under conditions that would destroy most people within weeks. He rationed his water with mathematical precision. When it ran out, he caught rainwater in his life jacket. When his food ran out, he fashioned a hook from wire in his flashlight and fished. When he needed bait, he caught seagulls with his hands, hiding under the carcass of one bird to ambush the next. When sharks gathered around the raft, which they did regularly, he fought them off with his water jug. When one came too close, he killed it with a hook, drank its blood, and ate the liver. He was found by Brazilian fishermen in April 1943, sunburned to the edge of recognition, but alive and able to walk. The British Royal Navy studied his survival techniques and incorporated them into training manuals. The record he set, 133 days alone at sea on a raft, has never been broken. Number 18. Vesna Vulovic survived a 2-mile fall with no parachute. On January 26, 1972, a Yugoslav Airlines flight was destroyed by a bomb at 33,000 feet over Czechoslovakia. The aircraft broke apart mid-air. Everyone on board was killed, except one. Flight attendant Vesna Vulovic, 22 years old, fell the entire distance, roughly 10,000 meters, in a section of the fuselage. She hit a heavily snow-covered slope on a mountainside in what is now the Czech Republic. She survived. She had a fractured skull, 2 broken legs, 3 broken vertebrae, broken ribs, and was in a coma for 27 days. A local villager who found her was a former medic. He kept her alive in the minutes before help arrived. Researchers who studied her case believe several factors aligned. The fuselage section acted as a partial buffer. The snow slope reduced impact force, and her position in the wreckage. She had been pushed into a food trolley by a colleague who tried to help her and was killed. may have kept her from being ejected at altitude. But here's what the physics cannot fully explain. The human body is not designed to survive a fall from that height under any conditions. The impact forces involved are simply incompatible with life. The margin of factors that had to align is so narrow that survival statisticians have essentially given up trying to model it. Vesna Vulovic returned to work at the airline after recovering. She went on to become a political activist in Serbia. She holds the Guinness World Record for the highest fall survived without a parachute. It has stood for over 50 years. No one has come close. Number 17. The Andes Survivors, 72 Days in the Mountains. On October 13, 1972, a Uruguayan Air Force plane carrying a rugby team, their families, and friends crashed into the Andes Mountains at over 4,000 meters elevation. Of the 45 people on board, 29 survived the initial crash. Then the real ordeal began. They had almost no food, no cold weather gear, no rescue equipment. Temperatures at night dropped to minus 30 Celsius. Their radio picked up a broadcast confirming that search operations had been called off. No one was coming. They survived for 72 days. 16 people made it out alive. The physical reality of what sustained them became one of the most debated ethical questions of the 20th century. The survivors consumed the flesh of those who had died in the crash. It was a decision made collectively, reluctantly, and after exhausting every other option. The men who eventually hiked out to find help had to cross some of the most extreme mountain terrain on Earth, with no climbing equipment, in improvised gear made from seat fabric and insulation. What the Andes case reveals about the mind under extreme duress is as significant as the physical survival. The survivors maintained social structure, they assigned roles, they held group discussions, they sustained hope actively and deliberately, treating it as a resource to be managed, because they understood, without being told, that the moment hope collapsed, the group would follow. The two men who hiked out, Roberto Canessa and Fernando Parrado, walked for 10 days through the Andes before reaching a Chilean shepherd. Parrado's mother and sister died in the crash. He walked out anyway. That's the kind of thing that doesn't have a clinical explanation. Number 16, Julian Kupka, 11 days alone in the Amazon. This is the story from the cold open. It deserves the full version. On December 24th, 1971, Christmas Eve, Lanza Flight 508 was struck by lightning over the Peruvian Amazon and broke apart at 3,200 meters. 17-year-old Julian Kupka, traveling with her mother, was still strapped into her seat when the plane disintegrated. She fell through the jungle canopy, rotating in her seat, and regained consciousness on the forest floor. Her mother was gone. She was alone, with a broken collarbone, a gash on her arm that was already attracting flies, one eye swollen shut, and wearing a sleeveless mini dress and one sandal. She had one thing that saved her life. Her father was a biologist who had worked in the Amazon. He had told her, years earlier, that streams lead to rivers, and rivers lead to people. Follow the water downstream. She walked for 11 days. She ate nothing. She had been told not to eat unknown jungle plants, and she followed that rule even while starving. The wound in her arm developed a maggot infestation she couldn't treat. She later described pouring gasoline from an outboard motor onto the wound to force them out. She removed about 30 maggots. On the 11th day, she found a boat, then a camp, then the loggers who owned it, who took her to safety. She was the sole survivor of 92 people on that flight. She later became a mammalogist, working in the Amazon. She went back to the jungle, the same jungle, and has spent much of her career there. The Amazon didn't break her. She made it her life's work instead. Number 15, Tsutomu Yamaguchi, survived both atomic bombs. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, on a business trip when the first atomic bomb was dropped. He was 3 kilometers from the hypocenter. The blast ruptured his eardrums, burned his upper body, and temporarily blinded him. He spent the night in Hiroshima. The next day, he traveled back to his hometown to recover. His hometown was Nagasaki. On August 9, 1945, 3 days after Hiroshima, He was in his office in Nagasaki, describing his experience in Hiroshima to his supervisor, when the second bomb detonated. He was, once again, approximately 3 kilometers from the hypocenter. He survived. Again. Yamaguchi is the only person officially certified by the Japanese government as a survivor of both atomic bombings, though historians believe there were others who survived both, but were never officially documented. He lived with radiation-related health complications for the rest of his life. He lost his hearing. He experienced recurring health crises. He watched his wife suffer radiation poisoning from contaminated water. He died in 2010 at 93 years old, having spent his later decades as an active voice for nuclear disarmament. He was asked many times what it felt like to survive something that killed hundreds of thousands of people twice. He never gave a satisfying answer, because there isn't one. Some things that happen to people simply cannot be translated into language that fits. Number 14. Alexander Selkirk, 4 years alone on an island. Before Robinson Crusoe, there was the real version. In 1704, Scottish sailor Alexander Selkirk had a violent disagreement with the captain of his privateer vessel over the seaworthiness of the ship. Selkirk refused to continue. He demanded to be put ashore on the nearest island, the uninhabited Maza Tierra in the Pacific, 670 kilometers off the Chilean coast. The captain agreed. The ship sailed away. Selkirk spent 4 years and 4 months alone on that island. The ship he'd refused to board later sank, killing most of the crew. His instincts had been correct. This did not immediately make his situation easier. He had a musket with limited ammunition. When it ran out, he learned to outrun feral goats on foot, catching them by hand after months of conditioning his body on the island's terrain. He built 2 shelters. He read his Bible aloud to prevent his voice from failing entirely. He tamed feral cats to sleep near him, to keep the rats from attacking him at night. The psychological dimension of Selkirk's experience was what captured imaginations when he was rescued in 1709. He had largely lost fluent speech from disuse. He moved differently. His years of chasing goats barefoot had changed how he walked. He was more comfortable in the wilderness than in civilization, and took years to fully readjust. When writer Daniel Defoe heard his account, he turned it into a novel. Robinson Crusoe became the template for the survival narrative in Western literature. The real story was stranger than the fiction. It usually is. Number 13. Joe Simpson, crawling out of a crevasse in the Andes. In 1985, British climbers Joe Simpson and Simon Yates summited Ciudad Grande in Peru, a peak that had never been climbed before by its west face. On the descent, Simpson fell and shattered his knee. His leg drove up through the joint. In the mountains, at altitude, in deteriorating weather, with no rescue possible, this is effectively a death sentence. Yates began lowering Simpson down the mountain on a rope, section by section, in the dark and the storm. Then Simpson went over an edge Yates couldn't see, dangling free over a cliff face, unable to climb up, unable to signal. Yates, unable to hold the weight and slowly being dragged off the mountain himself, made a decision that haunted him for years afterward. He cut the rope. Simpson fell into a crevasse. Yates descended alone, assumed his partner was dead, and returned to base camp. Simpson was not dead. He was at the bottom of a crevasse with a shattered knee, in the dark, with no food, no water, and no reason to believe anyone was looking for him. He crawled out. Over 3 days, he dragged himself across glaciers, through rock fields, on one functioning leg, hallucinating from pain and dehydration, singing songs to stay conscious, following the sound of a stream he could hear but couldn't see. He reached base camp hours before Yates was due to leave. The story he and Yates told, including Yates's decision to cut the rope, became the book and documentary Touching the Void, and one of the most studied examples of decision-making under extreme duress ever recorded. Simpson later said he did not blame Yates. He would have done the same thing. The fact that it was the wrong decision and he survived anyway is not something either of them has ever fully made peace with. Quick pause. If you're enjoying this, hit that like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it genuinely helps this reach more people who'd want to see it. Back to the countdown. Number 12. Anatoly Bukreev, running into the 1996 Everest storm. May 10th, 1996. A catastrophic storm hit the upper slopes of Everest and killed 8 climbers in a single night. The deadliest day in the mountain's history at that point. You may know it from the book Into Thin Air. What most retellings underemphasize is what one man did after the storm hit. Russian guide Anatoly Bukreev had descended to Camp 4 before the storm, a decision that was criticized as abandonment of his clients. What he did next isn't criticized by anyone who was there. With the storm still active in darkness at 7,900 meters altitude, a height where the body is already operating at the edge of what's physiologically possible, Bukreev went back out 3 times, alone, with no supplemental oxygen. He located climbers who had collapsed in the snow and were minutes from freezing. He dragged them back to camp individually, one by one. He saved 3 people who would otherwise have died that night. The human body at 7,900 meters without oxygen is running on reserves that medicine cannot fully account for. Exertion at that altitude is supposed to be nearly impossible. Sustained rescue operations are not something a solo climber is meant to be able to execute. Bukreev executed them anyway, in a storm, in the dark, 3 times. He died on Annapurna the following year in an avalanche. The climbing community named an award after him. It goes annually to the climber who best demonstrates courage in the service of others at altitude. Number 11. Aron Ralston, 5 days, 1 boulder, 1 decision. This one you may know. What you may not know is how precise and deliberate the worst part actually was. In April 2003, experienced outdoor climber Aron Ralston was descending a slot canyon in Utah alone. He had told no one where he was going when an 800-pound boulder shifted and pinned his right arm against the canyon wall. He couldn't move it. He couldn't free his arm. He was completely alone. He had limited water, a small amount of food, a cheap multi-tool. For 5 days, he tried to chip away at the boulder. It was sandstone, harder than his tool. He tried to rig mechanical advantage systems with his ropes. Nothing worked. He filmed video messages to his family. He began to accept he was going to die in that canyon. On the 5th day, something shifted in him that he has struggled to describe accurately in interviews. He stopped trying to free his arm. He decided to free himself from his arm. He understood that the decomposition process had already begun in the pinned tissue. He understood what he was about to do would be extraordinarily painful and might kill him from shock. He broke both bones in his forearm deliberately, using the canyon wall as leverage, and then used the dull blade of his multi-tool to cut through skin, muscle, and nerve tissue over the course of approximately 1 hour. He then applied a tourniquet using tubing from his hydration pack, rappelled down a 65-foot drop one-handed, and hiked several miles until he encountered a Dutch family who helped summon rescue. He had lost 40 pounds and a significant portion of his blood volume. He needed multiple surgeries. He now has a prosthetic arm. He went back to climbing within months. He has since summited all 59 of Colorado's 14,000-foot peaks, including in winter, one-handed. Number 10. Shackleton's Endurance Crew, 2 years in the Antarctic. In 1914, Ernest Shackleton led 27 men toward Antarctica with the goal of crossing the continent on foot. They never got close. Their ship, the Endurance, became locked in pack ice in January 1915 and drifted trapped for 10 months before the ice finally crushed it and it sank. What followed is, by any measure, the most extraordinary group survival story in the history of exploration. The crew camped on the ice, watching their ship sink, then dragged their 3 lifeboats across shifting ice for months before the ice broke up enough to launch. They sailed the open Southern Ocean, one of the most violent bodies of water on Earth, in wooden lifeboats to reach the desolate Elephant Island. 22 men stayed there while Shackleton and 5 others took the smallest lifeboat, the 22-foot James Caird, 1,300 kilometers across the Drake Passage to South Georgia Island, in winter, in seas with waves up to 15 meters, with no GPS, with a sextant, stars, and a navigator named Frank Worsley, who is still considered one of the greatest open boat navigators in history. They landed on the wrong side of South Georgia. Shackleton and 2 others crossed the island's unmapped mountain interior in 36 hours, a route not successfully repeated by trained mountaineers until decades later. He got help. He came back for the men on Elephant Island. All 22 were still alive. Every single member of the expedition survived. Not one man was lost. 2 years in the Antarctic. Not one man. The question historians and psychologists keep returning to isn't how they survived physically. It's how Shackleton kept 27 men functional and cohesive under conditions that should have broken group structure within weeks. The answer appears to be that he understood morale was a survival resource, as critical as food, as critical as shelter, and he managed it with the same deliberate attention he gave everything else. Number 9. Hiroo Onoda, 29 years, fighting a war that was already over. This entry is survival of a different kind. Survival built entirely on a belief that turned out to be wrong. Japanese Army Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda was stationed in the Philippines in 1945 with orders to conduct guerrilla warfare and never surrender under any circumstances. His commanders were explicit: hold your position regardless of what happens. Never give up. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. Onoda did not believe it. He continued fighting in the Philippine jungle until 1974. 29 years. He lived in the jungle, conducted raids on local villages, evaded capture, maintained his uniform, maintained his rifle, maintained his mission. He was not deluded in the clinical sense. He was operating on a set of premises that were entirely rational. If you accepted his starting point, his orders were clear. Japan would never surrender. Any evidence suggesting otherwise was Allied propaganda. People who came into the jungle to find him were enemies to be evaded or engaged. Leaflets were dropped. Newspapers were left. His family recorded messages. He interpreted all of it as psychological warfare. He was finally reached in 1974 by a Japanese student who had come specifically to find him. Onoda met him. He liked him. He still would not leave. He would not surrender until his commanding officer, who had to be located, now in his 80s, working as a farmer, came personally to the jungle and released him from his orders. He walked out, rifle in hand, uniform intact. He was 52 years old. He had survived 3 decades in the jungle on complete certainty. The certainty was wrong. The survival was real. Number 8. Beck Weathers, left for dead on Everest, twice. We return to the 1996 Everest disaster for a story that exists outside normal parameters. Dr. Beck Weathers was a Dallas pathologist who had paid to climb Everest as part of Rob Hall's guided expedition. He had a vision problem at altitude that left him effectively blind in the summit zone. He was told to wait at a fixed point for Hall to return and guide him down. The storm hit. Hall never came back. Weathers was left in the open at 8,000 meters in a storm that killed 8 people. 2 separate rescue teams found him and made the same assessment. He was too far gone to move, and moving him would risk the rescuers' lives. Both times, the decision was made to leave him. He was, by any clinical standard, dying. His wife in Texas received word that he was gone. Beck Weathers stood up. After lying exposed in the storm for over 12 hours, with no shelter, no functioning hands, his face a frozen mask, he regained consciousness. He has never been able to explain why, stood up, and walked into camp on his own. His tent mates, who believed him dead, described the moment he appeared at the tent as something they have never found language for. He required the most extreme frostbite amputations. His right arm below the elbow, all the fingers on his left hand, his nose, and parts of both feet. He underwent dozens of reconstructive surgeries. He returned to practicing medicine. He has said repeatedly that surviving Everest was the best thing that ever happened to him, because it was the moment he woke up to the life he had been sleepwalking through. The mountain took most of his hands. He says it gave him back everything else. Number 7. Ada Blackjack, 2 years alone in the Arctic. In 1921, a 23-year-old Inupiat woman named Ada Blackjack agreed to join an Arctic expedition to Wrangel Island, north of Siberia, as a cook and seamstress. She needed money for her 6 sons' medical care. She had no wilderness survival training. She had never hunted. The expedition, 4 young men and Ada, was meant to last 1 year. Supply ships couldn't reach them. The 4 men set out across the ice to seek help. They were never seen again. Ada was alone on Wrangel Island for 2 years. She taught herself to hunt seal by studying a book on trapping. She learned to navigate the island. She managed a camp, maintained equipment, and kept a journal. She cared for one of the men, Lorne Knight, who had contracted scurvy and could not travel. She nursed him until he died, then continued alone. She was terrified of polar bears throughout. She built a tower to watch for them. When one approached her camp, she shot it. She did this again and again. When a rescue ship finally arrived in 1923, they found her camp organized, her supplies managed, her journal intact, and Ada Blackjack alive, the only survivor of 5 people. She went home, used the expedition pay for her son's medical care, and largely avoided the fame that newspapers tried to thrust upon her. She did not consider herself a hero. She considered herself a mother who had done what was necessary to get back to her child, which is, if anything, more remarkable than the heroism version. Number 6. The 33 Chilean miners, 69 days underground. On August 5th, 2010, a collapse at the San Jose copper gold mine in Chile trapped 33 miners 700 meters underground. Initial assessments were not optimistic. Rescue teams drilling toward the refuge chamber had no confirmation the men were alive. For 17 days, no one knew. On day 17, a drill bit broke through to the refuge chamber. When it was pulled back up, a note was attached. Estamos bien en el refugio, los 33. We are well in the refuge, the 33 of us. They had been alive the entire time, managing their food, which amounted to 2 days of emergency rations for 33 men across 17 days, with a discipline that required each man to consume less than a spoonful of tuna every 48 hours. The rescue would take another 52 days. They were underground for 69 days total, in a space roughly the size of a small apartment, in heat and humidity that made the air barely breathable. What kept them together was structure. They held daily meetings. They assigned roles. They exercised. They maintained schedules. When psychological fractures began to appear, as they inevitably did, a group of them organized what they called a spiritual corner, a space set aside for whoever needed to decompress, away from the group. They understood, without being told by any psychologist, that the group's survival depended on each individual's mental state, and that the individual's mental state depended on the group. They managed both simultaneously for 69 days in the dark. All 33 emerged alive. The rescue capsule, named Phoenix, brought them up one at a time to a watching world. Number 5. Yossi Ginsberg, 3 weeks lost in the Bolivian Amazon. In 1981, 22-year-old Israeli backpacker Yossi Ginsberg set into the Bolivian Amazon with 3 companions and a guide who turned out to know considerably less about the jungle than he'd claimed. The group fractured. One member turned back with the guide. Ginsberg and a companion attempted to navigate the Tuichi River on a makeshift raft. The raft hit a waterfall. Ginsberg survived. His companion did not. He was alone in the Amazon. No map, no compass, no food, no tools. With the river and his instincts, he survived for 3 weeks. He ate whatever he could identify as probably not lethal. He constructed shelter from palm fronds each night. He was infested with parasitic larvae that burrowed into his forehead. He could feel them moving. He encountered a jaguar on a riverbank, and having no weapon and no escape, stood his ground and stared it down until it left. He was found by his companion, who had turned back. The man had organized a river search and recognized Ginsberg's fire on the bank from a passing boat. The parasites were removed in hospital. He required significant recovery. He went back to the Amazon years later to work on its conservation. Going back seems to be a recurring theme among people who should never want to see a place again. Number 4. Fridtjof Nansen, closest anyone had come to the North Pole on foot. In 1895, Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen and companion Hjalmar Johansen left their icebound ship and attempted to reach the North Pole on foot across the Arctic ice. They reached 86 degrees 14 minutes north, the furthest north any human had ever been at that point. before turning back. They had no ship to return to. The Fram had drifted. They were alone on the Arctic ice with dog sledges, kayaks, and no rescue plan. They survived the Arctic winter in a stone hut they built by hand on Franz Josef Land, living on whatever they could hunt, sleeping under bearskins, burning bear fat for heat and light for 6 months. What makes Nansen's story one of the defining survival accounts in history isn't just the physical endurance, it's what happened afterward. The experience did not break him. He became one of the most accomplished individuals of the 20th century, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, the architect of the Nansen Passport, which gave stateless refugees legal identity for the first time, and a global humanitarian. The man who spent winter in a hand-built Arctic stone hut went on to help define what it means to protect vulnerable human beings in a modern world. Survival, in his case, was a beginning, not a conclusion. Number 3. Rüdiger Neberg, crossing the Atlantic on a raft made of branches. German pastry chef and survival expert Rüdiger Neberg made several crossings and expeditions that belong on any extreme survival list. But the one that stands apart is his 1987 Atlantic crossing. He built a raft from young birch trees and branches, lashed together without modern fasteners, 5.8 meters long. He equipped it with traditional tools only. No GPS, no satellite phone, nothing electronic. He launched from the Canary Islands headed for the Caribbean. He was at sea for 78 days on a raft made of wood and rope. The raft began to disintegrate mid-Atlantic. Neberg repaired it continuously as pieces separated and waterlogged. He managed water and food through fishing and collection. He navigated by stars and current. He made it to Martinique in the Caribbean. But what Neberg represents on this list isn't just the physical crossing. It's what he did with the attention it generated. He used his reputation as a survival expert and his public profile to campaign for indigenous rights in Ethiopia, and spent decades working to end a traditional practice there that caused severe harm to young women, making enough international noise that the Ethiopian government eventually took legislative action. He survived the Atlantic on a pile of sticks to fight for people who had no voice. That combination of extreme capability and applied purpose is rare enough to be worth noting. Number 2. Slavomir Rawicz, The Long Walk. Note, this account is disputed by some historians and celebrated by others. It is presented here as a historical survival narrative with those caveats noted. In 1941, Polish army officer Sławomir Rawicz was held in a Soviet Siberian labor camp. He escaped with 6 other prisoners in the middle of a Siberian winter, through a hole in the fence, into temperatures of -40 Celsius, with minimal food and no map. They walked south for over a year, through Siberia, Mongolia, the Gobi Desert, Tibet, and over the Himalayas into British India, approximately 6,500 kilometers on foot. Of the 7 who escaped, 4 survived. They walked through one of the most hostile environments on Earth, subsisting on whatever they could find: berries, roots, insects, the occasional snake. In the Gobi, they went without water for days. In the Himalayas, they crossed passes at altitude with no equipment. What makes this account extraordinary, disputed or not, is what it reveals about the human capacity to keep moving when the only alternative is to stop. The men who didn't make it stopped moving, not always from physical failure. Sometimes they simply sat down and couldn't locate a reason to stand back up again. The ones who survived kept finding that reason, every morning, in conditions that provided none. Rawicz's book, The Long Walk, has remained in print since 1956. Whether every detail is accurate, the account has shaped how survival psychologists think about motivation under extreme prolonged duress. Because the question it poses is the central one. When everything argues for stopping, where does the reason to continue actually come from? Nobody has a clean answer, but the people on this list all found one. Number 1. Shackleton's Open Boat Journey. We put Shackleton's expedition at number 10. The full expedition deserves it, but the specific crossing, the 1,300-kilometer open boat journey through the Drake Passage in the James Caird, deserves number 1 on its own terms. Because it is, by the consensus of maritime historians, survival experts, and navigators, the single most extraordinary feat of human endurance and skill ever recorded. Let's be specific about what the Drake Passage is. It is the body of water between the tip of South America and Antarctica, where the Atlantic, Pacific, and Southern Oceans converge. It has no landmass to interrupt it all the way around the globe, which means wave energy accumulates without limit. Waves of 15 meters are not uncommon. Waves of 20 meters have been recorded. The weather is violent, unpredictable, and relentless. Modern vessels equipped with satellite navigation, stabilizing technology, and engines cross it with great caution. Shackleton crossed it in a 22-foot wooden lifeboat with a compass and a sextant. Navigator Frank Worsley took star sightings while other men held him upright on the heaving deck, steadying his instrument against the motion. He was able to take 4 sightings in 16 days. From those 4 data points, in one of the most hostile and featureless stretches of ocean on Earth, he navigated to within miles of their target. The boat was swamped repeatedly. Ice formed on the rigging fast enough to capsize them. Men went on deck in the dark with hammers to chip it off while waves broke over them. Their sleeping bags were soaked through from day one and never dried. Their food was intermittent. Their water supply was contaminated by seawater. They made South Georgia in 16 days. Then Shackleton and 2 others crossed the island's unmapped interior, a crossing of mountain terrain that experienced mountaineers equipped with modern gear could not replicate for decades, in 36 hours without stopping. Then he organized the rescue of the men on Elephant Island. Then all 22 survived. The James Caird crossing is number 1 not because it was the most painful story on this list or the most dramatic individual moment. It's number 1 because it required, simultaneously, physical endurance beyond what medicine predicts is possible, navigational skill of a precision that still astonishes experts, leadership that kept 6 men functional under conditions that destroy group cohesion within days. And then Shackleton turned around and did it all again for 22 more people. He did not survive and stop. He survived and went back. That is the difference between an extreme survival story and something that doesn't have a name yet.